Bandura social cognitive theory. Albert Bandura was born December 4, 1925, in the small town of Bandura in North Alberta, Canada. He was educated in a small elementary school, and after high school, he worked for one summer filling holes on the Alaskan Highway in the Yukon. He received his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of British Columbia in 1949 and went on to the University of Iowa, where he received his PhD in 1952. It was at the University of Iowa that he was introduced to the behaviorist tradition in learning theory. After graduating, he took a postdoctoral position at the Wichita Guidance Center in Wichita, Kansas. In 1953, he started teaching at Stanford University. While there, he collaborated with his first graduate student, Richard Walters, resulting in their first book, Adolescent Aggression, in 1959. It was while studying adolescent aggression that Bandura determined that behaviorism was too simple, and he suggested that behavior causes environment as well. Bandura was also president of the APA in 1973 and received the APA's award for distinguished scientific contributions in 1980. He continues to work at Stanford to this day. Albert Bandura's social learning theory states that behavior is learned from the environment through the process of observational learning. His theory suggests that people learn from one another through imitation, observation, and modeling. The social learning theory of Bandura emphasizes the importance of observing and modeling the behaviors, attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. Bandura states learning would be exceedingly laborious, not to mention hazardous, if people had to rely solely on the effects of their own actions to inform them on what to do. Fortunately, most human behavior is learned observationally through modeling, from observing others, one form of idea of how new behaviors are formed, and on later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action. Social learning theory explains human behavior in terms of continuous reciprocal interaction between cognitive, behavioral, and environmental influences. This behavior was coined as reciprocal determinism, meaning the world and a person's behavior cause each other. Bandura modified his theory in 1986 and renamed his social learning theory social cognitive theory as a better description of how we learn from our social experiences. The social learning theory consists of three basic concepts: observational learning, meaning people can learn through observation; intrinsic reinforcement, internal mental states are an essential part of the process; and the modeling process. Just because something has been learned does not mean it will result in a change in behavior. The social learning theory proposed by Albert Bandura has become the most influential theory of learning and development. The theory has often been called a bridge between behaviorist and cognitive learning theories because it encompasses attention, memory, and motivation. With many of its principles stemming from the concepts of traditional learning, Bandura believed that direct reinforcement could not account for all types of learning. To account for the shortfalls, Bandura added a social element, stating that people can learn new information and behaviors by watching other people. This type of learning is called observational learning. The two important ideas that Bandura added were: one, behavior is learned from the environment through the process of observational learning, and two, mediating processes occur between stimuli and responses. Albert Bandura's social learning theory states that behavior is learned from the environment through the process of observational learning. Children observe the people around them behaving in various ways. Children are surrounded by many influential models, such as parents within the family, characters of children's TV, friends within their peer group, and teachers at school. They pay attention to some of these models and encode their behavior to imitate at a later time the behavior that they have observed. They may do this regardless of whether the behavior is gender appropriate or not, but there are a number of processes that make it more likely that a child will reproduce the behavior that its society deems appropriate for its sex. Mediational processes. Bandura believes that humans are active information processors and think about the relationships between their behavior and its consequences. Observational learning could not occur unless cognitive processes were at work. These mental factors influence in the learning process to determine whether a new response is acquired. Therefore, individuals do not automatically observe the behavior of a model and imitate it. There is some thought prior to imitation, and this consideration is called mediational processes. This occurs between observing the behavior and imitating it or not. Now, there are four mediational processes that have been proposed by Bandura. The first is attention, the extent to which we are exposed or notice the behavior. For a behavior to be imitated, it has to grab our attention. We observe many behaviors on a daily basis, and many of these are not noteworthy. Attention is therefore extremely important in whether a behavior has an influence on others imitating it. In order to learn, you need to pay attention. Two is retention. How well the behavior is remembered. The ability to store information is an important part of the learning process. The behavior may not be noticed, but it is not always remembered, which obviously prevents imitation. It is important, therefore, that a memory of the behavior is formed to be performed later by the observer. Much of social learning is not immediate, so this process is especially vital in those cases. Even if the behavior is reproduced shortly after seeing it, there needs to be a memory to refer to. Number three is reproduction. This is the ability to perform the behavior that the model has just demonstrated. Once you have paid attention to the model and retained the information, it is time to actually perform the behavior that has been observed. And number four is motivation, the will to perform the behavior. The rewards and punishment that follow a behavior will be considered by the observer. If the perceived rewards outweigh the perceived costs, then the behavior will be more likely to be imitated by the observer. If the reinforcement is not seen to be important enough to the observer, then they will not imitate the behavior. In order for the observational learning to be successful, you have to be motivated to imitate the behavior that has been modeled. Social learning theory states that both reinforcement and punishment have an indirect effect on learning. They are not the sole or the main cause. Reinforcement and punishment influence the extent to which an individual exhibits a behavior that has been learned. The expectation of reinforcement influences cognitive processes that promote learning. Attention plays a critical role in learning and is influenced by the expectation of the reinforcement. Bandura states that humans are able to control their behavior through a process known as self-regulation. This process involves three steps. The first being self-observation. Humans look at themselves and their behavior and keep track of their actions. Two is judgment. Humans compare these observations with standards. These standards can be rules set by society or standards that the individual sets for him or herself. And third is self response. If after judging himself or herself, the person does well in comparison with a set of standards, he or she will give him or herself a rewarding self response. If the person does poorly, he or she will then administer a punishing self response to him or herself. Bandura's work is related to the theories of Jean Lavey, Richard Mayer, and Lev Vygotsky, which also emphasize the central role of social learning. These concepts are very similar in that it places the learning on what the learner sees and hears, which is considered modeling, as its key components. In contrast, some criticisms of social learning theory arise from their commitment to the environment as the chief influence on behavior. Critics think that it is limiting to describe behavior solely in terms of either nature or nurture, and attempts to do this underestimate the complexity of human behavior. Social learning theory is not a full explanation for all behavior, and is particularly the case when there's no apparent role model in the person's life to imitate for a given behavior. In summary, monkey see, monkey do, I can do just like you. This may sound trivial and may even be a bit silly, but under it all, it really states the basis for Albert Bandura's social cognitive theory. Human behavior is learned observationally through modeling, from observing others. From observing others, one forms an idea of how new behaviors are performed, and on later occasions, this coded information serves as a guide for action. As the bridge between behaviorist and cognitive learning theories, Bandura has developed a theory that encompasses a little bit of it all.